This bit of training is going to be about what the selling in process is, also known as media liaison. It's really the process of taking a story and communicating it to a relevant person in such a way that they could consider taking that story. Now, the main school of thought here is that content, not all content is created equally. There is going to be content that is either more or less appealing depending on the ingredients within it. Now, although the content may not change, how you communicate that content can change by what you emphasize. So a useful acronym, so on the client side we'll have MATO, messages, audience, timing, and objectives. A useful acronym that I used to have as a frame of reference to make sure I had the right ingredients for a story, but then also be able to know how to communicate what that story was Triple S. So it's worth writing this down, 3 S's, mainly to highlight what it was and then how it evolved. Okay, so even if you just usefully think of it as the 3 S's, that will still help you to think, right, if I've got 2 minutes to have a conversation with a producer, or if I've got 2 minutes to have a conversation with a news editor, what do I need to get across in that 2 minutes for them to genuinely be able to evaluate it? Otherwise, in your 2 minutes, you could fill them with fluffy language that doesn't actually help in any way. Hi, how are you today? We've got a story. Well, of course you got a story. I'm calling from this company. Like, none of it helps. So you want to think, right, how do I have the ability to give them what they need in the most efficient way possible? Because if you don't, they're not going to consider it. So any thoughts on what these 3 S's might be to either make the content stronger or weaker, depending on how much of these ingredients are in there?
Is one of them speed?
No.
Oh.
Suitability?
Not.
Suitable?
Well, the thing is, on the next acronym, where it evolved to, that kind of is in there, but it's under a different letter.
Something else. Scope, but then I'm thinking that's the next level as well, of how much scope it has.
No. So you're calling them up, and they need to evaluate whether or not it's appealing or not.
Mm-hmm.
So what kind of things are you naturally going to say? And let's look at this cue sheet here, because essentially this is a live campaign that we are going to be having conversations with radio presenters about, and producers and news editors, and they're going to be considering the story.
Significance?
Nope.
Do you suggest a story?
Well, the second part, you've got it, so it's the story.
Yeah.
Okay. If you have a conversation and you say, we've got a bit of content for you, they'll be like, well, what's the story? They need to know why they'd be interesting. Content for the sake of content, well, a dictionary is content. You know, Wikipedia is content. That doesn't mean they can start reading that out on the news or having it on their show. So the key thing is what makes it a story is the first S. And generally, you get 2 different forms of stories. You get news stories and you get feature stories. And if you have something that's really newsworthy, you're going to naturally find yourself speaking to more broadcast journalists and news presenters. And if you had more of a feature, you might speak to more of the radio presenters and the producers, mainly because it would be kind of weird if you got to a news editor or a broadcast journalist and you say, oh, we've got celebrity so-and-so with lots of tips about how to clean your house. It's kind of like, just imagine that we were doing the PR for, I don't know, Marie Kondo, for example. We've got her available and she's interested in giving tips to your audience. And like, with a fucking newsroom, you know. If she was the comment on how there is a new strain of bacteria in people's homes because they hoard stuff, then you've got a news story. So is it newsworthy or is it featurey? And then the way that you communicate that needs to be in accordance with, is it featurey, is it newsy? And also the people that you tend to speak to tend to be influenced by that as well. So the first S is, what's the story and is it news, is it featurey? What's the second S? do you think?
Stations?
No.
No.
Sound?
If we
How
in
do we make it sound?
no in the example that I just gave you, let's say we did have Marie Kondo available. What would make that appealing to a radio presenter?
Her status?
Yeah, it's the fact that she's famous. So the second S is spokesperson.
Spokesman.
Because if you've got a famous spokesperson, that's going to be more appealing than someone that isn't a spokesperson if it's a featurey story. So generally, what makes a spokesperson appealing or not, usefully, all end in ITY. So are they a celebrity? Are they an authority? And do they have credibility? All essential bits that make the spokesperson more or less appealing depending on what the story is. So generally, if you have a news story, they're going to be more interested in those people with credibility and authority. And if it's a feature, they're going to be more interested in those celebrities or personalities, if that makes sense. So depending on what you have. So for example, if we had, let's say, an appealing celebrity, let's say that we had, I don't know, David Beckham set up his grassroots football academies, and he's available to promote them on the week that children go back to school. If I said, oh, we've got a spokesperson talking about the importance of football for kids, and I never mentioned that we actually have David Beckham as a spokesperson, that means that I might get loads of people saying, oh, just send me an email, not really interested. And they may never even read the email where they figure out it's David Beckham that we've got available. If I said, look, we've got David Beckham in the studio next Wednesday talking about this, that gets their attention straight away. So if you've got a famous celebrity, you've got to mention that. And if you don't have someone famous, you don't mention their name because that doesn't add any value to it. You mention what they do. So if you have someone that is a doctor, but that doctor isn't famous, you would say, we've got one of the leading doctors that specialize in this area talking about that, because you're selling it based on the credentials of that spokesperson rather than their recognition. So the mistake would be, if we kind of look at the spokesperson, if you have got someone famous, like a David Beckham type of character, and you don't mention David Beckham, you're making your job harder. Equally, if you've got someone with no disrespect at all to Chris Forbes, who's the founder of Cheeky Panda, I don't know who Chris Forbes is. So if you call up and we've got Chris Forbes available, and they're like, well, that doesn't add any value to it, so why would you mention his name? You might mention his relevancy, you might mention his credentials. Well, he's done extensive research into waste, and he is a passionate advocate of minimising waste across the UK. Great, that's now relevant to the story, but you wouldn't say, we've got Chris Forbes available. Does that make sense? So depending on the ingredients that you have massively influences what you then do with that. So if I was trying to have this story, which is a feature essentially about the lack of, let's say, recycled material used in toilet waste, then if I wanted to do it badly, I would emphasize the featurey nature to newsrooms, and I would skip over the news element to those newsrooms. And then if I was speaking to presenters, if I wanted to make it really bad, I'd say, right, we've got all these stats and facts and things like that. Whereas the actual radio presenters aren't that keen on that. So you've got to give them relevant information depending on their role is really the key thing. So first S is story, second S is spokesperson. What's the third S?
What they're saying?
No.
Statement. Oh, is that on the right track?
Oh, God. Is it? I can think. Is it? I can't think of the word, but.
Look, if you look at newshook number 3, and this is probably potentially where that S would be ticked.
What are they going to say?
No. So it's stats.
Oh.
Okay. So if you were calling a radio station in Scotland, then they want to know, how does this story relate to Scottish people? So we might be able to look, for example, so if the UK uses 1.3 million tonnes, that's a UK story, and we're approaching BBC Radio Scotland. How do we break that 1.3 million tonnes of tissue every year to Scotland, which we can do using the workbook? So then if you say, well, look, to give you an idea, across the UK, 1.3 million tonnes of tissue are used every single year, and the average, like for example, with the average British consumer using approximately 127 rolls of toilet paper per year, we could take the population of Scotland, multiply that by 127, and then suddenly we've got however many billion tonnes or million tonnes it is specifically in, or how many rolls of toilet paper are used in Scotland, for example. Suddenly we've got a relevant stat for that particular region. And then if you go to Wales or Yorkshire, you've then got relevant stats for them. When you do that, it makes the content not just a little bit more interesting, but a lot more interesting, because you've got to think about a producer for BBC Scotland wants to have interesting Scottish stories for a Scottish audience. Someone at, let's say, Radio Air in Leeds, they're going to want interesting, content for that particular area. They're obsessed. If you think about, let's say, Viking FM, for example, they're going to want regional information for, East Yorkshire. They're going to want something relevant to their audience. Now, if you call up and you could make it regionally relevant, but you don't, there could be a really interesting spokesperson, but you don't highlight their credentials or fame, and you've got all these potential things, but you pick a weaker news hook and you're talking about that, then of course it's going to be a struggle to generate any interest. Does that kind of make sense? So it's really, really important, right as the very foundation, you've got to think, right, the cue sheet is the cue sheet, and this has been approved, so that's going to be the same document that they see. But the conversation that you have with a producer, a presenter, a news editor could change depending on what you say and who you're talking to. So if you have the same pitch effectively to a presenter as a newsreader, then you're weakening your chance of getting either. If you have exactly the same conversation with someone in Scotland that you do with someone on the South Coast, again, you're weakening your likelihood of the Scottish stations and the South Coast radio stations taking an interest, because you're not making it relevant to them. And that is how you make it work, if that makes sense. Now, as I said before, the three S's, that's the first evolution of the acronym. It evolved, it changed, and it changed to SSTR. And next to that, I want you to do your best representation of a star, just as a memory tool to help you remember. So it's not STAR, it's SSTR. But it kind of sounds like star phonetically, so you can draw a little picture of a star. That's atrocious. Okay, so then if you write it down kind of vertically, so then you can kind of have the actual things. Now, the first two S's are the same. They are exactly the same. So the first S, what's the story? That didn't change. And the second S, what's the spokesperson? Is it someone famous? Is it someone with lots of credentials? What's the relevancy to the particular story from the spokesperson? And a quick anecdote I'll share with you. Sometimes I've worked with PR agencies that think that somehow fame is the overall thing that they need. And I remember this is generally the case. It was quite a few years ago. We were in talks with an agency that were doing a campaign for a suntan lotion mainly aimed at kids. Okay, so their target audience was parents, but the suntan lotion was for children. And they said, right, we've got a spokesperson, a dermatologist, and I said, well, that's great, lots of credentials there. And they said, do you think we need someone famous? And I said, well, who do you have in mind? And they said, right, well, we've got this footballer that we can get, fairly good price. And I was like, okay, are they, a famous footballer? And they're like, yeah, famous. They're like playing the Premier League. And it's like, great. Well, I guess my first question is, are they a parent? And they're like, oh, I don't know. I don't think they are. And it's like, right, okay, they're in the Premier League now, but have they maybe played in a country where it's a lot hotter, and therefore have got first-hand experience of, the dangers of harmful UV radiation? No. And it's kind of like, I said to them, how would a footballer help? And interestingly, there was a link. It just wasn't a very strong link. And the research that they did found that kids looked up to role models like Ronaldo and Cheryl, all with fake tans, and they don't know they're fake tans, so they want to have a tan like their celebrity. That was the hook. Quite tenuous. And this guy, who's the footballer, wasn't known for either being a celebrity footballer or having fake tan. So why have him in the studio? All he could really say is, yeah, there's famous footballers that wear fake tan and that might inspire kids to be dangerous in the sun. That was it. It was a week. So my recommendation was, well, let's forget the footballer and let's use whatever budget you're going to have for that footballer. Let's put it into more coverage, and let's just focus on the dermatologist. And we make this more of a newsworthy story, highlighting that children could be influenced by these celebrities, their role models, to go out and not know that they're fake tan and just get sunburn and damage their skin. So the key thing is, fame is not the overall ingredient. It has to be relevant to the story. Okay, and your job when you're approaching the radio stations is to let them know how the spokesperson is relevant to the story and how the story is relevant to their region. Okay, so the first S is story, as we've talked about. The second S is spokesperson. What's the T relate to? Timing, okay. And generally there is a couple of ways that you can make a story time relevant or time sensitive. How would you do that? What's one of those two ways?
Through like proactive planning.
Yeah, so a platform or a peg. So it's kind of like, it's National Recycling Week this week and we've got so-and-so available. Or kids going back to school and blah, blah, blah. We've got so-and-so in the studio. Two of the campaigns that are being sold in right now, for example, are universities geared to coincide with A-level results. So if the people selling in that story aren't mentioning, hey, well, look, A-level results are released on this particular date. We've got a spokesperson from this university talking about the impact of this. If they're not saying that, it becomes a much more challenging way to generate their interest, because it's like, well, why would we want to speak to a university? And you can't make the assumption that they know the time relevancy. You can't make that assumption because guess what? Newsrooms are busy places and things change very, very quickly. And they're not thinking of, oh yeah, that's the timing that takes place. They may be, but you can't make that assumption. So you've got to link it to, if there is time relevancy, make it clear what that time relevancy is. But sometimes there is no time relevancy, and there is a second way that we can make it time relevant. What would the second way be?
It's in the news at the moment.
Well, that's if it's a very quick reactive. But generally, even if we're doing reactives, we then evolve the story onto a new evolved story from the original story. So how else can you do it?
I don't know if it just feeds into proactive, but is it like looking at what time of year it is?
That would be seasonality. So
Okay.
proactive could be summer or winter or National Picnic Week. They're all time relevant, platforms. So if we didn't have a time relevant platform, what would be another way to give it a sense of time relevancy?
Make the story more timely, like develop it so it's more something that can be at any time of the year.
So that's called an evergreen story. But then what we want to do is we want to give them a reason to make it now.
Right.
So if you just say, oh, you could use this anytime, and they're like, well, why would I do it now then?
But they want, yeah.
Maybe they're only available, make it out that the spokesperson in the
Well, this is
job's only available.
yeah. Well, this is a tactic that you're going to use actually in the calls to generate a bit more interest, but it doesn't make the story itself time relevant. You're just saying, there's a scarcity of the spokesperson, which is a way that you can use that to generate a bit more commitment or interest or buy-in from them, but that's not the thing that makes it time sensitive. Okay, so I'll give you the answer. It's new research. Okay, so if you said old research, research carried out a year ago, it's like, well, why would I care now? So brand new research just published today, or due to be published next Thursday, is set to reveal that blah blah blah, and in your area it's this. And actually, because that's taking place, we've got a relevant spokesperson who is a blah 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 talking about the implications for people in your area. Okay. Suddenly you're giving them all the ingredients to actually consider it. Now, if any of these ingredients are missing, it increases their likelihood to want to fob you off. Okay, because it's not that they're not going to consider it. It's just that they're not in a position to consider it based on the information that you've given over the phone. Okay. Now, the tricky thing is the words that they say, if they genuinely want to think it over, are exactly the same words that they're going to say if they just want to get you off the phone and have no intention of considering it. And that is, can you send me an email? Yeah. Okay. Now, before we go on to how we handle that particular thing, we need to look at the R. So we've got SSTR, first S, story. Is it newsy? Is it featurey? That's going to influence who you approach. Who's the spokesperson? Are they famous? Are they some kind of expert, or do they have credibility? Timing. Why would I consider this story right now? Okay. And then the R. What does the R relate to?
Response?
No.
You keep. I don't know if you said the word quite a lot. Is it relevancy?
Relevancy.
Oh,
Totally. It is relevancy. Now, the key thing is, if you don't make it relevant to them, why would they consider it? Why would they consider it? And typically, the key thing that you want to do is to make it relevant to their target audience. And there is a few ways in which you can do that. And one is you let them know what the research reveals about their audience rather than about British people in general. Okay? Because if it's, 50% of Brits feel this way, it's like, but our audience isn't Brits, it's people living in Hull. Why would we care about what Brits do? Okay? Now, if you say, well, look, 50% of people in the UK feel this way, but interestingly, the average is higher in Hull and the surrounding areas by quite a significant amount. It's 7% higher in Hull and the surrounding areas. We've got an expert talk about why that's the case and what people can do about it. Ooh, now I'm interested. Okay, you've got to make it relevant. So the stats are one of the ways that makes it relevant, but sometimes either the spokesperson or perhaps the case studies are also a way of making it relevant. So where was the spokesperson from? Where are they based? And we did a campaign with a TV presenter who had a business show, and this guy had businesses all around the country. He grew up around London. He studied in Lancashire. He had a business briefly in Scotland, and then he had a pub chain in Brighton and the South Coast. Well, there's an extra 5 radio stations we can get just by reaching out to those areas and saying, right, local lad, so-and-so, he was there, he studied there, and it's like the fact that he was semi-famous as well helped for that particular tactic, if that makes sense. So you need a way of making it feel relevant to them rather than they're just getting exactly what everyone else is getting. And that's why the phone element is so crucial, because you can customize that based on what you say. Does that make sense? Now, the final bit I would say about general advice in terms of how to pitch the story in is that there's going to be key messages in here, and then there's going to be what makes it an interesting story. Okay? And what makes it an interesting story is not the solution, but the problem. Okay? Now, it may be that the spokesperson can reveal the problem, but if you said, we've got Chris Forbes from Cheeky Panda talking about how we need to recycle more, you're not giving them a story. If you tell them that actually new research reveals that in your area, an extremely high amount of toilet rolls are being used only once from non-recycled material that's having a devastating impact on the planet, suddenly you've given them a story to think about. But if you don't give them that, they're not going to know, is really the key thing. So don't sell the key message, sell the problem. And that's really the goal. So hopefully that gives you a bit of a tip in terms of what to do. Now, the other thing I would say as an advice is once you have these cue sheets, make loads of notes on them. I would say grab a highlighter pen or grab a pen to underline certain things. What is the most interesting hooks here? If the first S is story, we've got, a few hundred words here. How do we hone in on what the actual story is? Because if you don't hone in on what the story is, they're not really going to consider it. And there is an element of this kind of almost like telephone Tetris. If by the time you get to the story, it's already game over, well, then you've already lost. If they've already sent, send me an email, not really interested, and you've got this great hook, you've kind of missed your window. So you've got to be able to get to the most important parts of what makes this a story quickly, because if it takes too long, there is no story. And equally, you want to prioritize the SSTR depending on what the strongest thing is. So if you've got a campaign with a celebrity spokesperson, you would lead with the spokesperson. If you don't have a celebrity, you would lead with the story and then the relevancy of the spokesperson to that story. But if you've got someone famous, the first sentence you say, "Hi, we've got famous person available in our studio on Thursday next week, talking about," then you go to the story. So spokesperson first in the story. But if there is no value in really the spokesperson, if the spokesperson doesn't sell it, why would you lead with that? So, a few years ago we had a celebrity chef, Ken Hom, available on the day before Chinese New Year. Now the story, there wasn't really a story. He was just promoting woks and Tefal, kind of cooking stuff. So we didn't lead with that. We led with, "Hi, don't know how your diary's looking, but we've got it's Chinese New Year. Chinese celebrity chef Ken Hom available the day before Chinese New Year, talking about the popularity of Chinese food and different trends and ways that your Chinese population in your area may be celebrating." Ooh, now I'm interested. It ticked all the boxes. Timeliness, it was Chinese New Year. Spokesperson was someone famous. The story was, different cultural trends. And we could say, right, what's the Chinese population? And we went on Wikipedia and we put biggest Chinese populations in the UK, so we could go to those places first. If that makes sense, that ticked all the boxes. And it was really easy to get coverage. If, however, we would have sold that in and said, we've got a spokesperson available for Chinese New Year talking about the best cooking equipment to cook Chinese food, we wouldn't get anything, because you're selling the key message, you're not highlighting what makes the story interesting. That would be an uphill struggle. So the idea that it doesn't matter what the story is or how you approach it is ludicrous, because we could easily make this more challenging. If you had a campaign with someone famous and I said, "I don't want you to say, you're not allowed to say who it is," you'd feel like you're fighting with an arm behind your back. It would be harder by doing that. So you've got to look at what makes it more interesting and appealing, and then focus on that bit first. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So then the other thing is, what do you actually do? How do you have the conversation? Well, generally speaking, as a rule of thumb, commercial radio stations that play lots of music, the presenters, unless you've got someone super famous, are not going to suddenly stop playing their regimented number of songs per hour to suddenly have a chat with some random person. It's not going to happen. So if it's a commercial radio station, you want to go to someone in news. Okay, so the big commercial brands, the Capitals, the Hearts, you want to speak to a news editor or a broadcast journalist. Okay.
Even if it's feature-free.
Well, I mean, if it's featurey, you've got to make that featurey story as newsworthy as it can be.
Okay.
You don't emphasize the feature. Top tips and advice. It's like, no. How do we make it a story? And you turn a featurey story into a news story. Now, they might not go for it, but that increases your odds of doing it. If you're calling a BBC producer, for example, even if you've got a news story, you've got to make that news story something conversational in nature. New research reveals that, but they want to discuss the ins and the outs and what people can do to make a difference and all that kind of stuff. So you evolve it into a more conversational piece, even if it's generally a news story, because any story could be communicated in such a way that makes it more newsy or more featurey, depending on how you describe it, if it makes sense. So generally for BBC producers or the BBC, you want to be speaking to more producers, and occasionally it might be the presenter themselves if they are their own producer. But if you can't speak to any of those, then try and speak to someone in news, because the BBC still has a news department. But generally speaking, you want to speak to more producers of the BBC, because you want to have those live, interactive, conversational pieces on air. But if it's commercial, generally the opening question would be, who's head of news there? Are they available? And then you run that by. And generally the pace at which you communicate things when you're speaking to a newsroom is quite quick, because they're up against it. The other tip with newsrooms is don't call them 3 minutes before the hour. Right now, for example, would be just about the right time. It's 5 past the hour, just about the right time that it's okay to call newsrooms. But calling them on the hour, can you imagine, like, you're just about to read a bulletin, the phone rings, like, can I take it or not? And then someone wants to have a chat with you about a story that could wait 5 minutes. You would break rapport. Now, community radio stations, generally you want to speak to the presenters or the station manager. And a useful catch-all, if you're not really sure, is who would be the best person to speak to regarding a spokesperson we have available for an interview? And then quite often, the receptionist knows who that person is, and they'll just kind of put you through to that particular person or let you know when they're available. So there's different ways of doing it. But it's no different when you're doing the creative researcher. If you've got a great pitch, but you just communicate it to the wrong person, you may as well not bother. You know, it kind of makes me laugh when I hear people and they're clearly trying to pitch the receptionist. It's like, are you fucking mad? It's like a waste of your time. So you gotta have the right conversation with the right person, which is generally either the news person, a producer, or a presenter, depending on the type of station that you're calling. And then you want to check that they're the right person. So that 2 yes intro is quite a nice way just to build rapport real quick. So you say, oh, hi there, is that Jim? Jim, can I just check? You're head of news there? Great, perfect. And then just go straight into it. And it's just a little bit of a verbal handshake. Whereas if they say news and you're like, I've got a spokesperson available for you, you don't know who you're speaking to. You don't know, they don't know you. There's been no verbal handshake. So everything is a bit awkward and you're pitching a stranger, you know. So that whole metaphor of like you wouldn't run into a dark room before you switch on the lights. That's why you want to use the switchboard, or if you do call the newsroom, who answers the phone? Switch on a few lights. Oh, who am I speaking with? I don't know if you know who produces that mid-morning show. Oh, great. Are they available now? When are they off air? Ask questions so you know who you're actually speaking to. And then when you're speaking to them, build rapport. And the easiest way to build rapport is good tonality. Check you're speaking to the right person. Check that they are the right person to actually speak to. And then get to the point and quickly. Now, you can use a little bit of sensory acuity there, and it's just a complicated way of saying using your judgment, because if someone answers the phone and they say, good morning, you know, newsroom, you've got a bit more time to play with. If they answer the phone, news, you've got moments to literally get to the point and quick. And then that changes as you speak. If they're like, good morning, how are you? Oh, great. Don't know if you're the right person to speak to, but we've got a spokesperson available. And I would always open with, we have a spokesperson available for an interview, and let them know the time and date. Now, human brains don't like trying to decode stuff. So if I said, right, we've got a spokesperson available on the 13th of August, I've got to work out what fucking day that is. And if I've got to do that, you've made it immediately more challenging for you to actually book something. So if Thursday the 13th is a Wednesday, let them know next Wednesday. Don't be making it more complicated. Don't be giving them 24-hour times. Between 800 hours and 1300 hours, we've got a spokesperson on the 13th. It's like, you may as well, you know, be giving them hoops to jump through that they don't need to jump through. Next Wednesday, we've got a spokesperson available, but only in the morning. And let them know that straight away. So it's regarding a spokesperson we have available for an interview next Wednesday talking about, and then you get straight to the story. Okay, now if the spokesperson's famous, mention their name, but if it isn't, just say we've got a spokesperson available on that date talking about, hit them with the story, and then let them know the relevancy of that spokesperson. So if it is someone, let's say, talking about waste, next Wednesday we've got a spokesperson available talking about how in Leicestershire 42 million rolls of toilet paper are wasted every single year, most of which is not using recycled paper. And we've got a spokesperson who is a environmental waste campaigner talking about why it's such an issue in Leicestershire and what could be done to help. Ooh, now I'm interested. You've given me the key bits in a way that I can actually process. The more complicated you make it, the harder it is. And you've got to be concise. If you can say it in 50 words rather than 100 words, say it in 50. You know, don't add words in for the sake of doing it. And that's why you want to highlight the key points, underline the key points, so that you're using the minimum words necessary to explain what it is and why it potentially is relevant for their audience. That kind of makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay. So make sure, identify the person you want to speak to, see if they're available, check that they still are that person that you thought they were. Introduce yourself. It's Adam from, and you could use Independent Media News or you can use IMN, doesn't matter. Use them interchangeably, find out whatever works from you. Generally, I used to say Independent Media News or IMN at reception and then kind of mix it up sometimes, but IMN I tend to prefer. It's Adam from IMN, but you're not saying that with upward tonality. It's Adam from IMN. You're already on a weak foot. It's, you know, you want to sound like you are reading the news. You want to have a news tonality. Hi, it's Adam from Independent Media News. We've got a spokesperson available next Wednesday talking about how in, and then don't say your region. It's lazy, okay? It's kind of like when you get those junk mail and you can see the little kind of shaded area where, you know, they've found out your name from a database and put your name on there, but you know it's not personalized, it's not tricking you in any way. So therefore, being lazy and just saying your region doesn't help. If you have got figures for Scotland, tell them. You know, we've got a spokesperson available next Wednesday talking about how in Scotland there is this much waste and what the impact could be and why it's such an issue. And we've got an environmental waste campaigner talking about the significance of that and what can be done to help. Don't know if that's of interest at all. Now, you want to check in with them nice and early. Don't know if that's of interest, don't know if that's even relevant. And you are expecting them to say at that point, yep, send it over, and then just give you an email address. Okay, and the reason why you're expecting that is because that's what most people are going to do. Because if they want to get you off the phone, they're going to ask for an email. If they want to think it over, they're going to send you an email. And if they want it, they're going to say send you an email. So what you don't get from the words, can you send me an email, is which of those three they are. Are they fobbing you off? Are they genuinely interested? Are they going to talk it over with someone else? So what follows them asking you to send an email is you filtering what kind of send me an email question it actually is. And the way that I do that is immediately create scarcity in the story. Look, more than happy to send an email. I'll get that over to you. My only slight concern is that, you know, this environmental waste campaigner that we have in the studio next Wednesday, recap on the overall premise. You've got something available. My only slight concern that is that we've only got them in the studio for about 3 hours. And I'd hate for you to get the email. Maybe it looks good for you, but then we don't have any time slots available. Just out of interest, would it be you or would it be someone else in the newsroom there that would probably be taking a look at this? Key reason is they might not even be on shift on the very day that they're doing it. So, you know, the idea that you are speaking to the right person isn't necessarily the case. Check in with them. You know, would it be you considering it, or would it be someone else considering? Oh no, that'd be news editor. Oh, who would that be? Great. And are they in later? Okay, great. So then even if you do send an email, you know the right person to follow up with. Immediately increases your chances of actually getting that booking. The other thing that you want to do is you want to, and if it's a BBC, you would do this. If it's a commercial radio station, you wouldn't, because commercial radio stations generally, for newsrooms, everything's pre-recorded. They don't do live. They might be reading the bulletin live, but they don't have the audio sound bits live because they don't know what is going to be said. They snip the sound bites and put them in. So if it's a BBC or a community radio station, you might ask the question, just out of interest, if you do it, and if you think of the whole kind of if frame of being a hypothetical, you're not saying you will do it, but if you did do this, do you think it'd be live or would it be pre-recorded? And they're like, oh, okay, yeah, probably would be live. Okay, well, I'm just conscious that they're only in the studio for a few hours. If you were to be interested in a story, would it be better to do something before or after 10 o'clock? And you want to pick a time right in the middle of the schedule. And the reason being is that at that point, even if they're semi-interested, they're probably going to look at whatever they use to schedule the interviews. Now, that might be an A4 diary system. It might be Outlook. It might be a whiteboard. You don't know what they're using, but here's what I will tell you. If you don't get them looking at the very thing that they need to see if they have availability or to book something, they're not going to book something on the back of a phone call. Just, it's impossible. So, you know, just wondering, would it be you? Would it be someone else? Would it be live? Would it be pre-recorded? But we don't have them for very long. So if you were to be interested, would it be better to do it before or after 10 o'clock, just so I can see if we've even got availability at the point that it would be more interesting for you? And then they're like, oh, right, okay, yeah, probably after 10. And then you give them two options. We've got a 10:15, we've got a 10:45. I don't know if those are even feasible for you. You're not saying do it at 10:15. You're saying, I don't know if 10:15 is even possible. And guess what? They're then looking not just at the diary, but at the time slot of 10:15. No, we could do that. Oh, okay. And would that be over the phone or would that be ISDN? Oh, probably ISDN. Okay, great. Well, look, I'll send you the email. But I'm just thinking what might be frustrating is that if we If you know that you can do 10:15, you look at the email, everyone's excited, but it's no longer there. That'd be a bit annoying. Do you want me to pencil you in for 10:15 on the basis that they'll talk about local relevancy to this story, all the local stats about how much waste is taking place in Leicestershire? You've got the 10:15. We know it'll be live. It would be with yourself, would be ISDM. If when you get the email that doesn't seem like something you want, don't worry, email me back, let me know, and we just free up that space. So it's not an expectancy, but I wouldn't want you considering something that might not be there. And sometimes if you've got the SSTR, if they like the story, the spokesperson is relevant, you can make it timely, either because of new research or time of year, and it's locally relevant to their region, then they sometimes just take it then and there. And what can make this role frustrating is if you are playing this kind of email game where you're having the conversations, but they're going to funnel you to email every single time, and then the power is with them because they've got the email, but you don't know what they're going to do with that email, and then you've got to phone them up to actually kind of get their commitment. Because as things stand, if you send them an email, same thing with a meeting. Like if you just send an email and they'll consider it, you then have to call them back to actually confirm the meeting. Okay. Whereas if you say, look, on the basis that you need to speak to one of your colleagues, it'd be very frustrating, I'm sure, if you spoke to one of your colleagues and you like the idea of the radio coverage, but then that's no longer available because of our non-competition policy. Why don't we pencil a time with one of my colleagues and then let me know if you don't want that? And that is so powerful in either context, because then the law of momentum is on your side. The interview or the meeting will happen unless they cancel it. Whereas if it's done the other way, nothing's happening unless you make it happen, and then there's more work for you to be done to do that, if that makes sense. Now, these are, whether you call it herding or closing or kind of steering them in the right direction, the key thing is they're not going to naturally just give you all that information. And you need to pay attention to the tonality that they answer those questions. If they're getting really impatient, okay, would it be you? Would it be someone else? Yeah, no, it would be me. Okay, would that be live or pre-record? Look, can you just send me the email? Right, respond straight away. Look, we'll get that email over straight away. Okay. If they're like, okay, look, can you send the email over? Look, I'm more than happy to send an email. I'm just thinking, like, what would be annoying? And you can judge from their tone of voice if you have to get off the phone and just let them on with it, because you don't know what's happening in their world, or if you've got a bit more room for maneuver to actually influence them. So you've got to use your ears. Okay. And that means that when you're actually on these calls, if the right person picks up the phone, I've seen people, their attention is on other things in the room, what other people are doing. It's kind of like, you're fucking mad, because there's so much information that you can pay attention to that if your attention is elsewhere, you're not picking up on that particular thing. The thinking noises, their tonality, their rhythm, their pace, their volume is telling you how much time you've actually got and what bits you're saying that are desirable to them. And if they're like, okay. And the other thing is, they can also talk about this and like, okay. And then you're getting them past that threshold. And if the interest passes the threshold, normally they'd be happy to agree to the actual interview then and there. But if you don't close them for that, guess what? You send an email to them, just like you'd send an email to everyone trying to fob you off. And then there's someone like me saying, right, how are you getting on? Got any bookings? And you're like, well, no, but there's a lot of people looking at it. And it's like, well, 3 of those might have actually booked it if you'd have phrased it in the right way, if that makes sense. It's not easy, but it's not meant to be easy. That's why for those few people that can generate sufficient rapport to have a conversation, sufficient interest that they're actually interested in the story because of what you present within all the things that you could say, you're giving them the most interesting and most relevant bits. You're essentially giving them the most polished version of the entire story that's the most appealing, it's the most relevant for their audience. It's everything desirable about the story. Letting them know their scarcity, letting them know that actually if they just kind of dwell it over, the slot might not be there, but we have it now. And I'm just worried because they've got such regional information they can talk about, for example, that in Wales there's this many millions of toilet rolls being wasted, there's this much tons, and it'd be a shame for them to have that local relevant information, but then you're not available at the point where they're available, or vice versa. Just out of interest, would it be you? Would it be someone else? Oh, okay, it would be you. Great. Would that be live? Would that be pre-recorded? Oh, okay, great, live. Okay, well, just so I'm checking if it's even feasible, would that be before or after 10 o'clock? Because we've only got them in the studio for a few hours. Before 10? Okay, well, look, we've got a 9:15 currently. Yeah, we've got a 9:35. could you even do those times? Yeah, no, we could do a 9:35. Okay, and would that be ISDN or over phone? Oh, okay, great. Well, tell you what, given that you could do a live interview at 9:35, and we've got this spokesperson available that time with such regional information, is it worth blocking out that time? We send you the email, and then if you don't want it, you let us know. Make it so easy for them to say yes and so difficult for them to say no, because if they like the story, then there's this fear that they could miss out on the story and lose it. Okay, and just to kind of give a bit of context here, for the first 2.5 years of the company's existence, I would generate all the clients myself and then have to get all the coverage myself. And at that point, I can't turn around to someone and give excuses. I just have to get the fucking coverage. So you learn ways, and some of the key ways that you learn is that you have to cover a lot of ground. You can't expect every call to turn into something. The same mistake that sometimes I see people making in that room of the butterfly thing, where it's kind of like, right, spend 5 minutes on a website, make a call, guess what, they're not there, spend another 5 minutes looking on a website, make a call. It's like, the game's not winnable if you play it that way. Call, have a meaningful conversation. Great, okay, are they interested, are they not? And then repeat the process. Same thing here. You know, I've seen it genuinely where over an hour, people have made like 1 or 2 calls to a radio presenter or a producer. You have to be infinitely lucky to be able to get bookings if you're covering that few ground. Know that actually a lot of people aren't in a position to make the decision today, but you want it on their radar, and it's not that you can kind of get loads and loads of bookings like that, but you want to increase the odds that takes place. So the goal really is that you want to make at least 10 to 15 calls per hour. Send your emails at the top of the hour so that you increase the likelihood that within those 10 to 15 calls you might get a booking or 2. Okay, great. And if you get 2 bookings, that's great. And if you only get 1, that's still good. And if you don't, well, then you want to be even more determined the next hour to get a booking. Okay? Not saying it's easy, but when you focus on it and you have that outcome in mind, that actually if you cover enough ground and you present the story to them in the most relevant, engaging, and attractive way possible, it does mean that someone could turn around and say, yeah, we'll do that. And in which case you can do it. And actually, even just 1 or 2 radio stations can make a big difference in terms of the overall, because it's normally you'll be doing it alongside someone else. Well, if you can get 1 or 2 radio stations, suddenly that budget goes down and down and down, closer to the finishing line, all the kind of the energy is there, and then it becomes very easy. But it does require an element of genuine tenacity, and I would say the calls are shorter just to manage your expectations. Don't expect 10-minute calls. They're going to last like 2-3 minutes. You know, you get straight to the point of the story, and guess what? They're busy. They're in busy newsrooms, or they're producing. They're looking at a big clock in their room. They've got the next thing they need to do. So you just want to run the story by them in a way that they could actually consider it, create that fear of loss. And if you do send an email, know the right person to follow up with. Okay, well, if I send the email now, if you like it, would you just let me know, or would I need to call you back, or what point would you actually consider this? Have the next steps in place before you do it. Otherwise, you're none the wiser at the end of that call than you were at the beginning of that call. And then, and the worst thing ever that I've seen are where people are looking for, what's the best way of doing it? They're looking to demonstrate that they've attempted, that there's no desire to actually kind of get the coverage or make the story relevant. Yeah, we got this story. What do you think? Oh, too busy. Okay. And then they kind of scribble that note down on some kind of feedback sheet. And then if anyone asks, oh no, they're too busy, they're full. No, they weren't. You just kind of were too quick to kind of avoid any kind of feeling that you're harassing someone or anything like that. So the key thing is kind of like make it the most desirable possible. Play that game about we've got this, but we don't have them very long. And what is that something you think you could be interested in? And you can also play the game of, look, if we could have regional stats here, do you think that might be interesting? And sometimes I used to play a little game where I used to pitch it originally as a UK story, and they're saying, yeah, not too regional enough. I say, well, look, can't guarantee, but if I do a bit of digging and they can come up with something highly relevant for your region on this story, do you think you'd consider it then? And they said, well, if you get regional stats, then yes. If I'd have offered them the regional stats straight away, they'd have said no. But by them perceiving me to be doing a bit of effort to find those regional stats, then they would say yes. So sometimes you can play a little bit of games, but the key thing is your eye needs to be on the prize of actually getting the booking. but not everyone will want it. And if they don't want it, it's because they've decided it's not right for their audience, or they're too busy that day, which are all valid reasons, or it might not fit with their format or whatever else. But you've got to increase the likelihood that that takes place. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah. Any? We're gonna stop the training in about 5 minutes. But is there any key questions or concerns or things that you weren't sure what to do?
Mine's just about the live and pre-recorded. So it's all done in the London or Manchester studios. That's right.
Yeah, and I'd say 9 times out of 10 or even more, it's London studios.
London, that's just you say live. Does that mean they are in a different place to the journalist?
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, for example, like there's quite a few stations that tend to do live. So, if it's a BBC station, let's say it's BBC Scotland, in the studio in London, they'll be talking through a mic. They'll have headphones on their ears, and while they're being asked the questions by the journalist connected via an ISDN line into their headphones, they're also actually broadcasting live with maybe a 5-second delay afterwards. So they're doing the interview, it's being broadcast at that same time. If it's pre-recorded, it's because they're recording it in what they call the desk. It's just literally, a studio, some kind of audio recording, like a little WAV file, and then they'll snip the bits that they're going to use, or maybe do the whole thing. Sometimes they'll say, look, we're doing this as live. So they'll do a conversational interview, but then the goal is that it would take place later on that day. So they might say, look, this is going to be going out on Saturday, so make reference to the weekend, or it's going out this afternoon, so don't mention this morning. They'll have certain things, so it still feels like it's live when they do it, even if it was pre-recorded a few hours before.
And the journalists, so they're always in their main place, but so it's just like I'm just trying to get an image in my head. The spokesperson's just kind of on their own there, and then they're talking to the journalists in different.
Exactly, yeah. So it's what's known as link up. So they'll be in a studio booth. They'll have mics. They'll have headphones. And then there'll be like a little glass kind of thing, and then behind that is the engineer and one of our teams. So, for example, at the moment, George is in the studio for the Association of the British Dispensing Opticians, and you've got the spokesperson, Daryl Newsom, in the studio. He's got his headphones, got his mic there. He'll be doing the things. George will be calling up the radio stations in advance to make sure they connect at the right time. And then the engineer is making sure that we're recording the levels at the right level and solving any technical glitches. And there might be the client there eating croissants and listening and watching to everything that's happening. So that's the overall setup. But then over a morning, they might be on BBC Scotland at 9:05. 10 minutes later, they're on a community radio station in Manchester, and then a station in Nottingham. And literally every 10 minutes, they're on a different radio station. Okay. So the interviews tend to last about 5 minutes on average. So they link up. They get ready. They might listen to a little bit of music from the, and then say, "Oh, and joining us, we've got so and so from Cheeky Panda. So tell us about how much waste we've got in our area." Oh, right. Well, the research actually in Leicestershire shows that for the UK it's 140 million toilet rolls, but actually in your area it's about 16 million every single year, and blah blah blah. And then they're doing the interview. That finishes. Engineer records it while the interview's taking place. Someone from our end is calling up the next radio station to make sure they're all lined up and it's all the right numbers, and then we do that kind of tour across the morning. Okay. Does that make sense? But the key thing is going into that studio, if there's nothing on the schedule, the client's going to be anxious, not going to get much coverage, probably won't hit budget, and that's why there's so much of an ethos of actually getting the bookings.
Yeah. Okay. I just wanted more like what the actual radio do involved with that side as well.
No, totally. And the first campaign that you bring in that has that route to coverage, you'll be in the studio seeing it all takes place. And I think you've been in the studio for...
I haven't. I was on jury service.
Of course you were for yours. So again, likewise, I think when you see it, and what can help is that if you go to the radio interview section of radiorelations.co.uk, we take the video camera and we film them all. So if you want to see what it looks like, there's loads of videos. You actually, that's because if you picture it in your head, you're going to explain it better, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely.
Cool. Any other questions?
No, I think that.
No. So the key thing is there is a workbook that kind of explains all this. What I'll probably do is a bit of training about how the workbook works and all that kind of stuff. But essentially, you'll have certain radio stations to call. You'll call them up. And what I would say is that it probably makes sense to do this alongside George. George will be working on this one. In the meantime, though, you want to be very, very clear on what the story is, underline the key bits, be all prepped for it, and what we'll probably do is record a few of the actual kind of sell-ins, so that, you know, for you and anyone else in the future, you'd be able to kind of hear, that's what a call to a BBC sounds like. That's a call to a commercial radio station sounds like. I don't think we have that at the moment, but we could easily do that in the future.
Yeah. I think it's just getting it all like in my head, because there's quite a lot to take in. But
yeah,
like,
well, I mean,
in
in many ways, it's a lot simpler than you think. Okay, present, of all the information that you could say, present the bits that are going to make it more appealing. Speak to the right person. Let them know that we have a spokesperson available for an interview on a particular day. Run them through that story. They're going to ask for an email. You say, look, more than happy to send the email. I'm just worried that we don't have the spokesperson for very long. And they can talk about, and then you hit them with another regional stat, and they're like, oh, okay. Well, look, would it be you? Would it be someone? And then just go through those kind of key questions. Now, sometimes they might say, well, look, how big's the sample size? They might have more questions, or where's the spokesperson from? Do you have a case study? All these things still come off the overall premise, and the overall premise is that there is a spokesperson available for a very short window of time, literally hours, and then after that they're not available. And in the time that they are available, they've got a story, and that story is regionally relevant to the very station that you're calling. And if they're interested, then we kind of need to know the right person to communicate with to make sure we do it right, is the overall premise.